Nancy Davis Reagan, born in Frances Robbins, on July 6, 1921 and died on March 6, 2016, was an American film actress and First Lady of the United States from 1981 to 1989 as the second wife of President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was born in New York City. After her parents separated, she lived in Maryland with an aunt and uncle for 6 years. When her mother remarried in 1929, she moved to Chicago and later was adopted by her mother's second husband. As Nancy Davis, she was a Hollywood actress in the 1940s and 1950s, starring in films such as The Next Voice You Hear, Night into Morning, and Donovan's Brain. In 1952, she married Ronald Reagan, who was then president of the Screen Actors Guild. He had 2 children from his previous marriage to Jane Wyman, and he and Nancy had 2 children together. Nancy Reagan was the First Lady of California when her husband was governor from 1967 to 1975, and she began to work with the Foster Grandparents Program. Reagan became First Lady of the United States in January 1981, following her husband's victory in the 1980 presidential election. Early in his first term, she was criticized largely due to her decision to replace the White House china, which had been paid for by private donations, and for accepting free clothing from fashion designers. She championed causes opposed to recreational drug use when she founded the Just Say No Drug Awareness campaign, which was considered her major initiative as First Lady. More discussion of her role ensued following a 1988 revelation that she had consulted an astrologer to assist in planning the president's schedule after the attempted assassination of her husband in 1981. She generally had a strong influence on her husband and played a role in a few of his personnel and diplomatic decisions. After Ronald Reagan's term as president ended, the couple returned to their home in Bel Air, Los Angeles, California. Nancy devoted most of her time to caring for her husband, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1994, until his death at the age of 93 on June 5, 2004. Reagan remained active within the Reagan Library and in politics, particularly in support of embryonic stem cell research, until her death from congestive heart failure at age 94 on March 6, 2016. And Frances Robbins was born on July 6, 1921, at Sloan Hospital for Women in Uptown Manhattan. Davis gave her birth date as July 6, 1923, a date cited through most of her life. She was of English descent. She was the only child of Kenneth Seymour Robbins, 1892 to 1972, a farmer-turned-car salesman who had been born into a once prosperous family, and his actress wife, Edith Prescott Luckett, 1888 to 1987. Her godmother was silent film star Alla Nazimova. From birth, she was commonly called Nancy. Robbins lived her first 2 years in Flushing, Queens, a borough of New York City, in a 2-story house on Roosevelt Avenue between 149th and 150th Streets. Her parents separated soon after her birth and were divorced in 1928. After their separation, her mother traveled the country to pursue acting jobs, and Robbins was raised in Bethesda, Maryland, for 6 years by her aunt, Virginia Luckett, and uncle, Audley Galbraith, where she attended Sidwell Friends School for kindergarten through 2nd grade. Nancy later described longing for her mother during those years. "My favorite times were when Mother had a job in New York, and Aunt Virgie would take me by train to stay with her." In 1929, her mother married Loyal Edward Davis, 1896 to 1982, a prominent conservative neurosurgeon who moved the family to Chicago. Nancy and her stepfather got along very well. She later wrote that he was a man of great integrity who exemplified old-fashioned values. He formally adopted her in 1938, and she would always refer to him as her father. At the time of the adoption, her name was legally changed to Nancy Davis. She attended the Girls' Latin School of Chicago, describing herself as an average student, from 1929, until she graduated in 1939, and later attended Smith College in Massachusetts, where she majored in English and drama, graduating in 1943. During her Hollywood career, Davis dated many actors, including Clark Gable, Robert Stack, and Peter Lawford. She later called Gable the nicest of the stars she had met. On November 15, 1949, she met Ronald Reagan, who was then president of the Screen Actors Guild. She had noticed that her name had appeared on the Hollywood blacklist. Davis sought Reagan's help to maintain her employment as a Guild actress in Hollywood and for assistance in having her name removed from the list. Ronald Reagan informed her that she had been confused with another actress of the same name. The two began dating and their relationship was the subject of many gossip columns. One Hollywood press account described their nightclub free times together as the romance of a couple who have no vices. Ronald Reagan was skeptical about marriage, however, following his painful 1949 divorce from Jane Wyman, and he still saw other women. After 3 years of dating, they eventually decided to marry while discussing the issue in the couple's favorite booth at Chasen's, a restaurant in Beverly Hills. The couple wed on March 4, 1952, at the Little Brown Church in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, in a simple and hastily arranged ceremony designed to avoid the press. The marriage was her first and his second. The only people in attendance were fellow actor William Holden, the best man, and his wife, actress Brenda Marshall, the matron of honor. Nancy was likely already pregnant during the ceremony. The couple's first child, Patricia Ann Reagan, later better known by her professional name, Patty Davis, was born less than 8 months later on October 21, 1952. Their son, Ronald Prescott Reagan, later better known as Ron Reagan, was born 6 years later on May 20, 1958. Reagan also became stepmother to Maureen Reagan, 1941 to 2001, and Michael Reagan, b. 1945. Her husband's children from his first marriage to Jane Wyman. Observers described Nancy and Ronald's relationship as intimate. As President and First Lady, the Reagans were reported to display their affection frequently, with one press secretary noting, "They never took each other for granted. They never stopped courting." Ronald often called Nancy Mommy, she called him Ronnie. While the president was recuperating in the hospital after the 1981 assassination attempt, Nancy wrote in her diary, "Nothing can happen to my Ronnie. My life would be over." In a letter to Nancy, Ronald wrote, "Whatever I treasure and enjoy, all would be without meaning if I didn't have you." In 1998, a few years after her husband had been given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, Nancy told Vanity Fair, "Our relationship is very special. We were very much in love and still are. When I say my life began with Ronnie, well, it's true. It did. I can't imagine life without him." Nancy was known for the focused and attentive look, termed the gaze, that she fastened upon her husband during his speeches and appearances. President Reagan's death in June 2004 ended what Charlton Heston called the greatest love affair in the history of the American presidency. Nancy's relationship with her children was not always as close as the bond with her husband. She frequently quarreled with her children and her stepchildren. Her relationship with Patty was the most contentious. Patty flouted American conservatism, rebelled against her parents by joining the nuclear freeze movement, and authored many anti-Reagan books. The nearly 20 years of family feuding left Patty very much estranged from both her mother and father. Soon after her father's Alzheimer's disease was diagnosed, Patty and her mother reconciled and began to speak on a daily basis. Nancy's disagreements with Michael were also public matters. In 1984, she was quoted as saying that the two were in an estrangement right now. Michael responded that Nancy was trying to cover up for the fact she had not met his daughter, Ashley, who had been born nearly a year earlier. They two eventually made peace. Nancy was thought to be closest to her stepdaughter Maureen during the White House years, but each of the Reagan children experienced periods of estrangement from their parents. Reagan became the First Lady of the United States when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president in January 1981. Early in her husband's presidency, Reagan stated her desire to create a more suitable first home in the White House, as the building had fallen into a state of disrepair following years of neglect. White House aide Michael Deaver described the second and third floor family residence as having cracked plaster walls, chipped paint, and beaten up floors. Rather than use government funds to renovate and redecorate, she sought private donations. In 1981, Reagan directed a major renovation of several White House rooms, including all of the second and third floors and rooms adjacent to the Oval Office, including the press briefing room. The renovation included repainting walls, refinishing floors, repairing fireplaces, and replacing antique pipes, windows, and wires. The closet in the master bedroom was converted into a beauty parlor and dressing room, and the west bedroom was made into a small gymnasium. The First Lady secured the assistance of renowned interior designer Ted Graeber, popular with affluent West Coast social figures, to redecorate the family living quarters. A Chinese pattern, hand-painted wallpaper was added to the master bedroom. Family furniture was placed in the president's private study. The First Lady and her designer retrieved a number of White House antiques, which had been in storage, and placed them throughout the mansion. In addition, many of Reagan's own collectibles were put out for display, including around 25 Limoges boxes, as well as some porcelain eggs and a collection of plates. The extensive redecoration was paid for by private donations. Many significant and long-lasting changes occurred as a result of the renovation and refurbishment, of which Reagan said, "This house belongs to all Americans, and I want it to be something of which they can be proud." The renovations received some criticisms for being funded by tax-deductible donations, meaning some of it eventually did indirectly come from the tax-paying public. Reagan assumed the role of unofficial protector for her husband after the attempted assassination of him in 1981. On March 30 of that year, President Reagan and 3 others were shot by the attempted assassin 25-year-old John Hinckley Jr. as they left the Washington Hilton Hotel. Nancy was alerted and arrived at George Washington University Hospital, where the president was hospitalized. She recalled having seen emergency rooms before, but I had never seen one like this, with my husband in it. She was escorted into a waiting room, and when granted access to see her husband, he quipped to her, "Honey, I forgot to duck," borrowing the defeated boxer Jack Dempsey's jest to his wife. An early example of the First Lady's protective nature occurred when Senator Strom Thurmond entered the president's hospital room that day in March, passing the Secret Service detail by claiming he was the president's close friend, presumably to acquire media attention. Nancy was outraged and demanded he leave. While the president recuperated in the hospital, the First Lady slept with one of his shirts to be comforted by the scent. When Ronald Reagan was released from the hospital on April 12, she escorted him back to the White House. Press accounts framed Reagan as her husband's chief protector, an extension of their general initial framing of her as a helpmate and a Cold War domestic ideal. As it happened, the day after her husband was shot, Reagan fell off a chair while trying to take down a picture to bring to him in the hospital. She suffered several broken ribs, but was determined to not reveal it publicly. Though Reagan was a controversial First Lady, 56% of Americans had a favorable opinion of her when her husband left office on January 20, 1989, with 18% having an unfavorable opinion, and the balance not giving an opinion. Compared to fellow First Ladies when their husbands left office, Reagan's approval was higher than those of Rosalind Carter, Hillary Clinton, and Melania Trump. However, she was less popular than Barbara Bush and Michelle Obama, and her disapproval rating was double that of Carter's. Upon leaving the White House, the couple returned to California, where wealthy friends purchased them a home in the wealthy Eastgate Old Bel Air neighborhood of Bel Air, Los Angeles, dividing their time between Bel Air and the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara, California. Ronald and Nancy regularly attended the Bel Air Church as well. After leaving Washington, Reagan made numerous public appearances, many on behalf of her husband. She continued to reside at the Bel Air home, where she lived with her husband until he died on June 5, 2004. Ronald Reagan died in their Bel Air home on June 5, 2004. During the 7-day state funeral, Nancy, accompanied by her children and military escort, led the nation in mourning. She kept a strong composure, traveling from her home to the Reagan Library for a memorial service, then to Washington, D.C., where her husband's body lay in state for 34 hours prior to a national funeral service in the Washington National Cathedral. She returned to the library in Simi Valley for a sunset memorial service and interment, where, overcome with emotion, she lost her composure and cried in public for the first time during the week. After receiving the folded flag, she kissed the casket and mouthed "I love you" before leaving. During the week, CNN journalist Wolf Blitzer said, "She's a very, very strong woman, even though she looks frail." Following her husband's death, Reagan remained active in politics, particularly relating to stem cell research. Beginning in 2004, she favored what many considered to be the Democratic Party's position, and urged President George W. Bush to support federally funded embryonic stem cell research, in the hope that this science could lead to a cure for Alzheimer's disease. Although she failed to change the president's position, she did support his campaign for a second term. On March 6, 2016, Nancy Reagan died of congestive heart failure at her home in Los Angeles at the age of 94. On March 7, President Barack Obama issued a presidential proclamation ordering the flag of the United States to be flown at half-staff until sunset on the day of Reagan's interment. Her funeral was held on March 11 at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. Representatives from 10 First families were in attendance, including former President George W. Bush and First Ladies Michelle Obama, Laura Bush, Hillary Clinton, and Rosalind Carter. The other representatives were presidential children Stephen Ford, Tricia Nixon Cox, Lucy Baines Johnson, and Caroline Kennedy, and presidential grandchild and Eisenhower Flottle. Other prominent individuals in attendance included California Governor Jerry Brown and former governors Arnold Schwarzenegger and Pete Wilson, then former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and former members of the Reagan administration, including George P. Shultz and Edwin Meese. A sizable contingent from the Hollywood entertainment industry attended as well, including Mr. T, Maria Shriver, Schwarzenegger's then wife, Wayne Newton, Johnny Mathis, Angelica Houston, John Stamos, Tom Selleck, Bo Derek, and Melissa Rivers. In all there were some 1,000 guests. Eulogies were given by former Prime Minister of Canada Brian Mulroney, former Secretary of State James Baker, Diane Sawyer, Tom Brokaw, and her children Patty Davis and Ron Reagan. After the funeral, Nancy Reagan was interred next to her husband. Thanks for watching HerStory channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe our channel.